If you had met me 3 years ago, you would have seen a woman who had everything under control. Or at least, that's what I let the world believe. I was 34 years old, sitting in a glass-walled corner office on the 42nd floor of a financial firm downtown, managing corporate restructuring strategies for mid-market acquisitions. I was the person companies hired when they were bleeding capital and needed someone with a cold, analytical eye to cut away the dead weight and save the enterprise. I knew how to look at balance sheets, spot hidden vulnerabilities, and execute plans with surgical precision. But outside those glass walls, my personal life was built on a completely different set of rules. I believed in loyalty. I believed in unconditional partnership. I believed that when you vow to stand by someone through sickness and health, through riches and poverty, those words are an ironclad contract written on your soul, not just empty poetry recited for a room full of wedding guests, drinking expensive champagne. I grew up in a household where my mother worked 2 jobs just to make sure we never missed a mortgage payment. I learned early on that security isn't something handed to you on a silver platter, it's something you build with your own 2 hands, brick by painful brick. So when I met David, I didn't see an ambitious executive with a flawlessly tailored suit and a smooth smile. I saw a man who needed direction. I saw potential. I saw someone I could build an empire with. For 7 years, I was the quiet, invisible engine behind every single piece of success David enjoyed. I was the one who pulled 18-hour workdays, managing my own high-stress corporate portfolio, while simultaneously coming home to proofread his quarterly reports, draft his executive presentations, and fix his balance sheet errors before his supervisors ever saw them. I swallowed my pride, hid my own exhaustion, and poured every drop of my energy into making David look like a rising star at Apex Logistics. I genuinely thought we were a team. I thought that every late night I spent fixing his mistakes, every dollar of my own savings I poured into his dreams, was an investment in our shared future. I assumed that the man who held my hand at the altar, looking into my eyes with what seemed like devotion, would be the same man holding my hand if the ground beneath us ever shook. I was wrong. I was completely, foolishly wrong. I didn't realize that to David, I wasn't a partner at all. I was just a ladder he was using to climb to the top, and the moment I cracked, he wouldn't hesitate to kick me away. When I first met David, he wasn't the polished executive who walked into my hospital room with expensive leather shoes and a tailored suit. He was a low-level, struggling account manager at Apex Logistics, living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment with a stack of maxed-out credit cards and a mountain of unpaid bills. He had massive ambitions, but absolutely zero discipline, no financial literacy, and a terrifying habit of drowning under pressure. I fell in love with his potential. That was my first fatal mistake. I looked at his chaotic life and thought, I can help him fix this. Within 6 months of dating, I took over his finances. I sat him down at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet, mapped out a strict debt consolidation plan, and built a strategy to turn his sinking career around. When he was passed over for a team lead position during his 2nd year at Apex, he broke down in tears on my sofa, claiming his boss had it out for him. I didn't just comfort him. I went to work. I spent my entire weekend completely rebuilding his portfolio presentation from scratch. I redesigned his pitch decks, coached him on executive presence, and rehearsed every single line of his presentation until he could deliver it in his sleep. The next month, he got the promotion. He came home with a bottle of cheap sparkling wine, laughing about how he had slayed the room, completely forgetting that every word that came out of his mouth in that boardroom was written by me on my laptop at 2 a.m. When we got married 2 years later, I threw myself entirely into his success. David wanted to climb the ladder at Apex Logistics, but he lacked the executive credentials to reach senior management. He applied for an executive MBA program at a top business school, a program that cost $80,000. David didn't have $80 to his name, let alone $80,000. So, I unlocked my personal savings. I took $80,000 that I had painstakingly accumulated from my early career tech dividends, premarital stock investments, and years of disciplined saving, and I paid his tuition in full. I wiped out his student debt before it even started, freeing him to focus entirely on his career while I carried the financial burden of our household on my shoulders. For 7 years, I was his silent ghostwriter, his financial advisor, his personal recruiter, and his housekeeper. While David was out networking, at late-night steak dinners and happy hours, spending his quarterly bonuses on leased luxury cars and bespoke suits to fit in with the upper management, I was at home handling every single bill, managing our mortgage, and covering our daily living expenses from my corporate salary. Every time I tried to talk to him about saving for our future, buying a permanent home, or putting money into an emergency index fund, he would wave his hand dismissively. "Evelyn, you're being paranoid," he'd say, pouring himself another glass of scotch. "I'm on the fast track to partner at Apex. Once I get my equity share, we'll be set for life. Stop worrying like an accountant." What David didn't know was that while I was paying his tuition, covering our living expenses, and watching him spend every dime he made, I was quietly maintaining a completely separate financial life. Early in my corporate career, long before I ever met David, I had set up a private, locked investment trust in my maiden name. Every performance bonus I earned at my own firm, every dividend from my early tech stocks, and every royalty payment from independent consulting work went directly into that trust. I never mentioned it to David, not because I was planning to leave him, but because my mother had taught me a fundamental lesson growing up. Never let a man control your ability to survive. David assumed I was just a quiet, obedient corporate strategist who lived to serve his rising star. He genuinely believed that my salary was the only asset I had, and that without him, I was just a sensible girl in a plain blazer. He had no idea that while he was busy posturing as a big shot in the halls of Apex Logistics, I was quietly building a war chest, and I would end up needing every single cent of it. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It began with a slow, chilling distance that crept into our home long before my body gave out. But when the hammer finally fell, it hit me at the exact moment I was least capable of fighting back. It started 6 months before that night in the hospital. I collapsed right on the polished hardwood floor of my home office, halfway through a quarterly audit report. My body just surrendered. Years of working 80-hour weeks, carrying the financial weight of our household, and absorbing David's endless stress had completely wrecked my immune system. The diagnosis was swift and terrifying, an aggressive, rare autoimmune crisis that triggered massive internal inflammation, systemic fatigue, and nerve damage that temporarily left me unable to walk without assistance. The doctor was clear. I needed 6 months of aggressive, high-dose intravenous therapy, absolute bed rest, and total isolation from stress. In the first 2 weeks, David pretended to care. He posted a photo on his social media, holding my hand in the hospital bed, captioning it with a long, poetic paragraph about standing by his warrior wife. The comments flooded in, his colleagues calling him an inspiration, a saint, a devotion-driven husband. But once the likes stopped rolling in and the camera went away, the mask slipped completely off. His visits became fewer and shorter. First, it was 3 times a week for 20 minutes, then once a week. Then, 2 weeks would go by, where the only sign of his existence was the steady drain on our joint checking account. While I was lying under fluorescent hospital lights, shivering from the fever spikes of my medication, David was out at high-end steakhouses, taking prospective clients out on our joint credit cards, claiming he was building client relationships to cover my medical bills. The truth was far worse. On a cold, rainy Tuesday evening, the reality of what I was dealing with smashed through my denial. My physical therapist had just finished working on my legs, leaving me exhausted, hooked up to a fresh IV bag of anti-inflammatory steroids. The door to my room pushed open. I thought it was the night nurse checking my vitals. It was David. Beside him stood a sharp-faced woman carrying a leather briefcase, his attorney's paralegal. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't ask how my pain levels were. He didn't even step all the way up to my bedside. He stood at the edge of the linoleum floor, smoothing the lapel of his tailored wool coat, looking at me with a mixture of disgust and cold detachment. "David?" My voice was barely a raspy whisper. "What is this?" Without saying a word, he signaled the paralegal. She stepped forward, unzipped her briefcase, and placed a thick white envelope right on my stainless steel food tray, sliding it past my half-eaten gelatin bowl to sit inches away from my IV line. "I'm filing for an immediate dissolution of marriage, Evelyn," he said, his voice completely flat, devoid of a single drop of human warmth. "I've spoke with my legal team. Given your condition, you won't be returning to corporate work anytime soon. I'm at a pivotal moment in my career at Apex Logistics. The board is evaluating candidates for junior equity partner next month. I need a partner who can host dinners, travel to global summits, and maintain an image. I can't be anchored to a bedroom." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard the cardiac monitor beside me began to beep faster and faster. "We've been married 7 years, David. I paid for your MBA. I built your career. And I'm grateful," he interrupted, waving his hand as if brushing away an annoying fly. "But business is business. I've already removed my belongings from the house. I transferred $40,000 from our joint accounts today to retain my legal team and secure a high-rise lease near the office. The house is going up for immediate sale to liquidate equity, and you have 30 days to find alternate living arrangements." He took one step backward toward the doorway, his pristine Italian leather shoes echoing against the quiet hospital floor like a hammer hitting a coffin nail. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I'm not wasting my prime years playing nurse to an invalid, Evelyn. Sign the emergency temporary custody of assets, or my lawyers will tie you up in court until you run out of health insurance." He turned on his heel and walked out, the paralegal following closely behind, leaving the door swinging slowly in their wake. I lay there in the quiet room, the rhythm of the heart monitor filling the silence. Beep, beep, beep. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and stinging against my pale skin, but as it reached my chin, something inside me snapped. The paralyzing fear, the heartbreak, the agonizing sense of betrayal, it all boiled away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline core of pure rage. He thought I was broken. He thought because my legs were weak, my mind was dead. I looked down at the white envelope on my tray, then up at the rhythmic green line pulsing on the monitor. David thought that monitor was tracking the last gasps of a dying woman's spirit. He had no idea it was counting down the seconds until his complete, total, and calculated destruction. I didn't cry after the hospital door clicked shut. I stared at the ceiling tiles, watching the green pulse line on the cardiac monitor normalize. My heart rate slowed down, settling into a steady, deliberate rhythm. The weakness in my muscles was real, but the paralyzing fear was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless clarity I hadn't felt in years. David believed he had played a masterclass in corporate survival, cutting off the dead weight before it dragged him down. He had no idea he had just declared war on a woman who knew every single flaw in his armor. First thing Wednesday morning, while the hospital was still quiet, I called Sarah, a fierce corporate litigator and my closest confidant from my early analyst days. She arrived at my hospital room within 2 hours, taking notes as I laid out every detail of David's stunt. "He thinks he trapped you, Evelyn," Sarah said, pulling out a legal pad. "He filed an emergency motion, assuming you'd be too sedated or broken to respond within the 14-day window. File a counter motion by 4 o'clock today," I told her, my voice clear and steady. "Freeze every single asset tied to his name. The house, his luxury car lease, his personal accounts. Demand full financial disclosure under oath. He drained $40,000 of marital funds while I was in intensive care, Let's see how his pristine reputation at Apex Logistics holds up when a judge orders a forensic audit of his bank statements. By Friday afternoon, Sarah had secured an emergency court injunction. David's attempt to force a quick sale of our home was legally blocked, and the court ordered him to maintain the mortgage payments until the divorce was finalized. His face must have turned white when his attorney called him to explain that his quick exit was now a legally binding trap. While Sarah handled the courtroom skirmishes, I focused on the war. My body was broken, but my brain was untouched. I hired a private physical therapist who specialized in aggressive neuromuscular rehabilitation. For 5 months, I turned my recovery into a full-time job. I pushed through searing nerve pain, relearning how to stand, how to walk without support, and how to project the absolute authority I had surrendered during my marriage. Every grueling hour on the parallel bars was fueled by a single image: David's face when he realized who actually controlled his destiny. By the time 8 months had passed, I walked out of that hospital on my own 2 feet, completely transformed. My health had fully restored, my posture was rigid, and my mind was sharper than it had ever been. It was during my physical rehabilitation that I began digging into Apex Logistics. Using my private research network, I quietly audited the firm's public filings, credit ratings, and debt structures. What I discovered made me smile for the first time in nearly a year. Apex Logistics was in serious financial trouble. They had overextended their credit lines on an aggressive European expansion that failed, leaving them with $12 million in high-interest debt coming due within 90 days. They were desperately seeking a private equity partner to inject capital, or they would face an institutional takeover that would wipe out the current board. And who was leading the internal team at Apex trying to organize the restructuring? David. He had promised the CEO, Arthur, that he could secure an investor group to save the company, using that promise as his primary leverage to secure his dream role: senior managing partner. He was dangling his entire career on a thread, completely unaware that I held the shears. I accessed my private, locked investment trust, the war chest I had built quietly over a decade. Combined with my early tech stock dividends and an elite network of angel investors who trusted my market instincts, I mobilized $12 million in liquid capital. I set up a private holding entity structured through a discrete legal shell and gave it a name that fitted the occasion: Vanguard Capital Group. David thought he had discarded an invalid. In reality, he had just handed his life over to his new majority shareholder. Execution in business, as in revenge, requires complete emotional detachment. I didn't rush into Apex Logistics with dramatic threats or emotional outbursts. I acted like the corporate strategist I had always been: invisible, meticulous, and utterly lethal. Through Vanguard Capital Group, my corporate attorneys reached out directly to Arthur, the founder and CEO of Apex Logistics. Arthur was a desperate man. His board was threatening to oust him, the bank was threatening to freeze the company's operational credit lines, and the firm's stock value was plummeting. He was holding daily, chaotic meetings with low-level venture funds, trying to piece together micro-investments to keep the doors open. When my legal team presented Vanguard Capital's terms, Arthur nearly wept with relief. We offered a clean, immediate $12 million capital injection. We agreed to absorb their high-interest debt, stabilize their operational credit, and protect Arthur's personal seat on the board. In exchange, Vanguard Capital required a strict, non-negotiable condition: 52% controlling interest in Apex Logistics, voting dominance on all executive promotions, and absolute confidentiality regarding the identity of Vanguard's managing partner until the formal announcement at the quarterly board meeting. Arthur agreed within 48 hours. The contracts were signed, sealed, and executed under strict non-disclosure agreements. While the deal was closing in the shadows, I monitored David from afar. Through standard due diligence access granted to Vanguard Capital, I had full sight of Apex's internal email servers, executive memos, and calendar invites. It was like watching a man walk blindfolded toward a cliff. David was on cloud nine. He genuinely believed that the sudden, anonymous $12 million investment into Apex was the result of the pitch decks he had circulated months prior. He took full credit for saving the firm. He spent weeks strutting around the executive suites, telling junior analysts that his vision had brought in Vanguard capital. He spent thousands of dollars from his remaining credit line to buy a brand new, top-tier wardrobe, custom gold cufflinks, and a luxury watch to fit his soon-to-be-announced title as senior managing partner. I read his sent emails to his close colleagues. In one message, he wrote, "Once the new capital hits the books on Friday, Arthur is making my partnership official. Dropping the dead weight in my personal life was the best business decision I ever made. Focus is everything." I printed that email, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my leather portfolio. As the managing partner of Vanguard Capital, my first official administrative directive to Arthur was simple. Schedule an all-hands executive assembly for Friday morning at 9 a.m. in the grand mahogany boardroom on the top floor. The agenda listed on the company-wide calendar invite was brief. Formal presentation of majority shareholder and announcement of senior executive restructuring. David was so confident in his upcoming triumph that he forwarded the invite to his personal contacts, inviting them to celebrate with him at an upscale lounge downtown immediately following the meeting. He had reserved a private table, ordered vintage champagne on credit, and told his friends that Friday morning would mark his official entry into the top 1% of the industry. He had no idea that for the past 3 weeks, my legal team and I had been restructuring the entire organizational chart of Apex Logistics. We reviewed every expense report David had ever submitted, every account he had managed, and every client he had lost. We drafted a brand new corporate blueprint that eliminated his padded salary, stripped away his corporate perks, and redefined his position based purely on his actual, unassisted metrics. On Thursday night, the evening before the big announcement, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room. My skin was glowing, my eyes were bright, and my strength was fully restored. I picked up a tailored, charcoal gray silk suit, sharp, elegant, and uncompromising. I smoothed the lapels, checked my watch, and took a deep breath. David thought he had discarded an invalid on a hospital bed. Tomorrow morning, he was going to meet his new boss. The mahogany doors of the 44th floor boardroom were double-paned glass, framed in polished brass. Through them, I could see David sitting right at the head of the 20-foot executive conference table, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, swirling it like high-end champagne. He was laughing, chatting with the VP of marketing, leaning back in his leather chair with his legs crossed, displaying a pair of brand-new, Italian leather loafers. He had a silk pocket square tucked into his tailored blazer, looking every bit the triumphant corporate savior he believed himself to be. The room was packed. 25 top-tier executives, senior partners, and board members were seated along the table, whisper-talking about the mystery capital group that had rescued Apex Logistics from total collapse. At precisely 9 a.m., my 2 corporate attorneys pushed open the heavy double doors. I stepped through the doorway. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor with a deliberate, metallic rhythm. I wore a tailored charcoal gray silk suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, razor-sharp bun, holding a slim leather portfolio under my left arm. I walked with my head held high, full posture restored, completely unassisted. The room fell dead silent. David's smile froze. His hand stopped mid-air, the crystal glass trembling slightly between his fingers. His face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent ash gray as his eyes tracked me walking toward the head of the table. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to reconcile the radiant, commanding woman standing in front of him with the pale, dying invalid he had left on a hospital bed 8 months ago. "Evelyn," he stammered, his voice cracking, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. What are you doing here? This is an internal executive board meeting." "Sit down, David," Arthur interrupted, stepping forward from the side podium. Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, his voice echoing across the quiet room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the managing partner and controlling owner of Vanguard Capital Group, Evelyn Vance." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Senior partners sat up straight, instantly recognizing the power shift in the air. David's glass hit the mahogany table with a loud, sharp clack, water splashing over the rim onto his pristine sleeve. "No, no, that's impossible. This is a mistake. She's been sick. She doesn't have—" "I have 52% of the voting equity in this firm, David," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly absolute. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. I took my place at the absolute head of the table, pulling out the executive master chair, the seat reserved for the controlling authority of Apex Logistics. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper with a bold red stamp across the top. "As my first executive action as chairwoman," I began, looking directly into David's wide, terrified eyes, "I have reviewed the proposed senior partnership promotions for this quarter. David's application for senior equity partner has been reviewed under Vanguard Capital's performance criteria." I picked up a red pen, uncapped it, and drew a thick diagonal line across his file, right in front of the entire board. "Rejected," I stated flatly. In fact, an audit of David's accounts revealed that over 60% of his closed accounts were built on frameworks, pitch decks, and client strategies created by external consultation that he no longer possesses. Furthermore, his division has run at a 15% margin loss over the last 2 quarters, masked by inflated projection reports. David stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floorboards. "Evelyn, you can't do this. This is personal. You're abusing corporate authority because of a private divorce." "Business is business, David," I quoted, repeating the exact words he had spat at my hospital tray 8 months ago. "Isn't that what you told me?" I handed a folder to my chief legal counsel, who distributed copies to every board member. Effective immediately, the executive marketing division is being restructured. David's current managerial role is abolished. To prevent severance payout liabilities under his existing contract, he is being reassigned to entry-level data analyst in our lower basement processing office, reporting directly to a junior supervisor 10 years his junior. His corporate expense account is canceled, his leased company vehicle is revoked, and his base salary is adjusted to entry-level tier. Gasps filled the room. David stood frozen, his jaw trembling, his chest heaving, as 20 of his peers stared at him in complete, horrified silence. The prestige, the status, the high-rise lifestyle, the $40,000 he had drained from our joint accounts. It had all bought him a ticket to the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder. "If you choose to resign, David," I added, closing my portfolio with a crisp snap, "you are welcome to hand your badge to security on your way out. However, according to your financial disclosures in our ongoing divorce proceedings, you currently owe $180,000 in personal debt, legal retainers, and lease obligations. I doubt you can afford to leave." He stared at me, completely destroyed, his eyes glossy with unshed tears of pure humiliation and rage. He couldn't speak. He couldn't fight back. The man who tried to bury me while I was down was now buried under the weight of his own hubris. I turned my back on him, opening the quarterly operations ledger, and looked at the rest of the board with a polite, professional smile. "Now, gentlemen, let's talk about the future of Apex Logistics." 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. David fought almost every term at first, but the financial records left him very little room to argue. The $40,000 he had taken from our joint account while I was in the hospital was included in the final settlement, and my attorney made sure every dollar was properly accounted for. The house was sold only after the court-approved agreement was complete, and I walked away with everything I was legally entitled to. More importantly, the private investment trust I had built before our marriage remained mine. David never became senior managing partner. For several weeks after the board meeting, he stayed at Apex in the reassigned analyst position, apparently convinced that he could somehow work his way back into the executive circle. But the title, the expense account, the company car, and the people who once surrounded him were gone. Eventually, he resigned. The last I heard, he had moved into a small apartment outside downtown and was trying to rebuild his career while dealing with the personal debts he had accumulated, chasing an image he could never actually afford. I didn't celebrate his downfall. By then, I didn't need to. I returned to the work I had always been good at. Under Vanguard Capital, we stabilized Apex Logistics, restructured its debt, eliminated wasteful spending, and rebuilt the divisions that had been struggling long before I arrived. And for the first time in 7 years, I stopped using my intelligence, my money, and my energy to build someone else's future. I started building my own. Sometimes I still think about that night in the hospital, the white envelope sitting beside my IV, David standing at the foot of my bed telling me that business was business. At the time, he believed he was walking away from a woman who had nothing left to offer him. What he never understood was that my weakest moment didn't reveal how little power I had. It revealed how much of my power I had been giving away. David taught me one lesson I will never forget. Never destroy yourself trying to build someone who would abandon you the moment you stopped being useful to them. I gave him 7 years of loyalty. He gave me divorce papers when I needed him most. In the end, I didn't have to destroy his life. I simply stopped holding it together, and once I did, everything he had built on my shoulders came crashing down without me. So tell me this. If you were in my position, would you have simply taken the divorce settlement and walked away? Or would you have done exactly what I did and made sure David finally faced the consequences of everything he had done? I want to know what you would have done.